was not always a woman of silence. There was a time when my voice filled a small kitchen in Ohio, when laughter came easily, and when I believed that love, once given, could never turn into something sharp enough to cut you open from the inside. My name is Isha Khan, and I am a widow. But before that word defined me, I was a wife, a mother, and a woman who believed her son was her greatest blessing. My husband passed away when our son, Daniel, was just 14. A sudden heart attack. No warning, no goodbye that felt complete. One moment he was sitting at the dining table asking about Daniel's school grades, and the next moment he was gone from our world, leaving behind a silence that still echoes in my bones. I remember the days after his death as if they were made of fog. People came and went, offering condolences that faded quickly. But Daniel, he became quiet, too quiet for a boy his age, and I told myself that I had to be strong for him. I was his mother. I had to carry both of us forward. We lived in a modest house in a small American suburb. I worked long hours cleaning offices at night while Daniel studied during the day. I would return home exhausted, my hands cracked from chemicals, but I never let him see my pain. Because every time I looked at him, I saw my husband's face in his features, and I felt like I still had a reason to keep breathing. I saved every dollar I could. I skipped meals so he could eat better. I wore the same clothes for years so I could buy him books, tutors, anything that would help him succeed. And he did succeed. Daniel was intelligent, brilliant even. Teachers praised him, neighbors admired him, and slowly my tired heart began to believe that all my sacrifices were shaping a future worth the suffering. He got into college on scholarship. The day he left home, I cried in silence after he boarded the bus. He hugged me tightly and said, "Mom, I'll make you proud one day." Those words became my survival. Years passed. He studied business. He changed, slowly, almost invisibly at first. New clothes replaced old ones. His phone calls became shorter, then less frequent, then formal. "Hi, Mom, I'm busy." "Hi, Mom, I'll call later." "Hi, Mom, I can't talk right now." But I still believed in him, because that is what mothers do. They believe even when reality starts whispering warnings. After graduation, Daniel stayed in New York. He started working with a financial firm. I was proud, even if I only understood half of what he explained. He talked about investments, clients, opportunities. His voice had changed too, more confident, more distant. Then one day, he told me he was going to start his own company. I remember sitting in my small kitchen in Ohio, holding the phone with shaking hands, listening to him speak about ambition, success, and risk. And when he paused, I said only one thing. "I trust you, my son. Whatever you need, I am with you." That sentence, that trust, it became the door I unknowingly opened. He needed initial capital, a lot of it. Investors were hesitant, he said. Banks were slow, he said. But I had something small, my house. The only thing your father left us, I told him. The place where every memory of my life was buried. He didn't ask me directly to sell it. He didn't need to. Because love sometimes convinces itself. "I can use it as collateral," he said gently. "Just for a short time. Once the business grows, I'll get it back for you. Even better, I'll buy you a bigger house in New York." New York. The word sounded like a dream. I had never dared to dream for myself. I signed the papers he sent. Lawyers explained things in fast English I barely understood. Daniel said it was all standard, safe, temporary. I trusted him. He was my son. And a mother does not calculate danger in her child's voice. Months passed, then a year, then silence again. Calls reduced to holidays. Then even holidays passed without a message. One winter morning, a letter arrived. Official, legal, cold. Foreclosure notice. I remember holding it in my hands, sitting on the floor of my kitchen, unable to understand how words could feel heavier than stone. My house, my only home, was no longer mine. I called Daniel immediately. No answer. I called again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Days passed like that. Each ring became a prayer. Each silence became an answer I didn't want to accept. And then, one evening, he answered. "Mom, I'm in a meeting," he said quickly. "Daniel, I got papers about the house." A pause, a long one. Then his voice returned, different this time, colder. "Oh, that. Don't worry, it's just paperwork. I told you it was temporary." "Then why is it saying I have to leave?" Silence again. Then he said something I still hear in my sleep. "Mom, I'll handle it. Just don't complicate things right now." And the call ended. That night I did not sleep. I sat by the window, watching snow fall over a street I would soon no longer live on. I kept telling myself there had to be a mistake, that my son would fix it, that love could not end like this. But love does end like this, slowly, quietly, without warning. The eviction came 2 weeks later. A truck, 2 men, boxes, my life reduced to objects placed in cardboard. I stood outside my home, holding a small bag of clothes, while strangers walked in and out of what used to be my kitchen, my bedroom, my memories. And I called him one last time. This time, he picked up. "Daniel, I have nowhere to go." A long silence. Then his voice, low and controlled. "You should stay with a relative for now. I can't deal with this right now. I have investors coming." And that was it. No anger, no explanation, just absence. The line went dead. I remember standing there for a long time after that, not crying at first, just standing, as if my body had forgotten how to move. Then the tears came, not loud, not dramatic, just slow, unstoppable surrender. A woman passing by asked if I needed help. I could not answer her. Because how do you explain to a stranger that the person who destroyed you is the same person you once carried in your arms? That night, I sat in a small shelter in Chicago, surrounded by people I did not know, holding a paper cup of tea that tasted like nothing. And for the first time in my life, I understood something painful and final. My trust had not been broken by a stranger. It had been used by my own son. And this was only the beginning. I spent my first night in the shelter without closing my eyes even once. The room was not loud, but it was never quiet either. There was always a cough, a chair shifting, a distant voice speaking to someone who wasn't there. I lay on a thin mattress that sank too deeply under my body, staring at the ceiling as if it might explain how my life had ended up here. I kept replaying Daniel's voice. "Don't complicate things right now." As if I was a problem. As if the woman who raised him, who fed him with her own hunger, had become something inconvenient. Morning arrived without announcement. No sunlight felt warm in that place. It only made everything more visible. The tired faces of strangers, the brokenness that did not need words. I sat up slowly, my body aching in ways I didn't understand at first. Then I remembered there was no home to return to, no kitchen, no window where I used to watch snow fall. Everything had already been taken. A volunteer woman came around with forms. She asked questions I struggled to answer. "Do you have family?" I hesitated. "Yes," I said quietly. She looked relieved. "Can they take you in?" I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was too heavy to fit into simple words. I had a son, a successful son, a son who built an empire in New York while I slept in shelters. But I also had no son, because the Daniel I raised would never have left me here. I will try to contact him," I finally said. She nodded and moved on, already used to half answers. That morning, I stepped outside the shelter for the first time since arriving. Chicago air cut through my lungs like cold glass. I walked slowly, not because I was lost, but because I had nowhere to go fast. I found a small diner nearby. I ordered tea with the few dollars I had left. The waitress looked at me kindly, but I avoided her eyes. Kindness now felt like something I didn't deserve. I took out my old phone. The screen was cracked, battery weak. I scrolled to Daniel's name. For a moment, I just stared. Then I called again. Ring, ring, ring. Voicemail. I didn't leave a message this time. What would I even say? Your mother is homeless because of you. The words stayed inside me, heavy and burning. Days passed like that. Shelter at night, streets during the day, coffee shops where I sat too long just to stay warm. I learned how to survive in a city that didn't know my name. And slowly, I started noticing things I had never seen before. A woman sleeping on a bench holding a grocery bag like it was precious. A man counting coins with shaking hands. A young girl asking strangers if they had spare food. I used to think homelessness was something distant, something that belonged to other people. Now I understood it arrives quietly, without warning, without asking permission. But what hurt most was not my situation. It was the thought of Daniel living his life, without thinking of me at all. One afternoon, I gathered courage I didn't know I still had and went to a public library. I used their computer. My hands trembled as I searched his name. And there he was. Articles. Photos. Rising tech entrepreneur in New York. Daniel Kahn secures major investment deal. He was smiling in every picture. Standing in expensive suits, shaking hands with men in glass buildings, living a life that looked like success carved in gold. And in none of those images was there any sign of the woman who once cleaned offices at night so he could study. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. So this was where my sacrifice had gone. Into glass buildings and polished shoes. Not into remembering me. A man beside me in the library noticed my expression. "You okay, ma'am?" I quickly closed the screen. "Yes," I lied. Because I had learned something new now. Pain becomes private when no one is left to witness it. That night, I tried calling Daniel again. This time, he answered. His voice was sharper, rushed. "Mom, I told you I'm busy." "I saw your name online," I said softly. "You're doing very well." A pause. "Yes, I am," he replied carefully. There was pride in his tone, but no warmth. I swallowed. "I don't have a home anymore." Silence. Longer than before. Then he spoke, slower this time. "Mom, I already told you, I'm handling it. These things take time." "I'm in a shelter," I said. Another pause. Then something changed in his voice. Not concern, not fear. Inconvenience. "Why would you go there?" he asked. "You could have stayed with someone." "I have no one, Daniel." A breath on the other side. Then, like a decision being made, rather than a feeling being expressed. "I can send you some money. Just don't contact me so frequently right now. It's not good for my image if things become complicated." Image. That word stayed with me long after the call ended. I looked around the shelter again that night. People wrapped in thin blankets. People forgotten by systems and sometimes by families. Was this what I had become? A complication. Days turned into a week. Money did arrive. A small transfer. Not enough to rebuild anything, but enough to keep me alive. I used part of it for food, part of it for a bus pass. I moved between shelters now, trying not to stay in one place too long, as if permanence itself was dangerous. But every night, before sleep, I thought of Daniel. Not the man in suits. The boy who used to fall asleep on my lap while I read him stories. The boy who once said, "Mom, I will never leave you alone." And I would whisper into the darkness, "You already have." One evening, while sitting outside a shelter, I met an old woman named Ruth. She had been on the streets for years. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, as if she had made peace with things I still couldn't understand. She looked at me and said, "You look like someone who lost more than a house." I didn't answer, because she was right. I had lost a son without losing his body. That is a different kind of grief, one that does not end. It only learns to sit quietly inside you. Ruth handed me a small piece of bread. "Don't wait for people who decided not to come back," she said. I held that bread for a long time. Not because I was hungry, but because I was beginning to understand something I had refused to believe. Sometimes love is not enough to make someone stay. And sometimes trust is not broken by accident. It is used carefully, deliberately, until there is nothing left to take. That night, as I lay down again in the shelter, I made a decision I didn't fully understand yet. I would not stop calling Daniel. Not because I believed he would answer, but because a mother does not erase her child, even when he has erased her. And somewhere far away, in the city of New York, my son continued building his empire, while I learned how to survive without mine. And this was not the end of my story. It was only the part where I stopped being his mother in the way I used to be and started becoming something else entirely. The days after that began to blur together, as if time itself had lost interest in marking them properly. I stopped counting mornings. In the shelter, mornings didn't mean new beginnings. They only meant another day of surviving something I did not choose. My life had reduced itself to small routines. Wake up before others so I could wash my face in cold water. Fold the thin blanket neatly so no one would notice I had slept like that. Sit quietly until breakfast was served. Then leave the building and walk into a city that never once asked who I used to be. Chicago became both my shelter and my punishment. Some days I would sit near the river and watch people pass by, students laughing, office workers rushing, couples holding hands. I would look at them for too long, not out of jealousy, but out of disbelief. Because once, I was part of that world too. Before grief, before sacrifice, before my own son turned my trust into something I could no longer recognize. Daniel still did not call. But I called him. Every few days, sometimes every day. Not because I expected an answer anymore, but because silence from him felt like another form of abandonment I needed to confirm. One afternoon, I found myself sitting in a small public park. Autumn leaves were falling around me, slow and indifferent. I opened my phone again. His name. I pressed call. Ring. Ring. This time, he picked up faster than before. Mom, he said sharply, as if he had already anticipated my call. I'm in a meeting. I just wanted to hear your voice, I said softly. A pause. You're calling too often, he replied. The words were not loud. They didn't need to be. They landed inside me with precision. I don't have anywhere else to call, I said. Another pause, shorter this time. Then his voice changed, slightly controlled, slightly irritated. Look, I told you I'm handling things. You need to be patient. I can't keep dealing with emotional conversations right now. Emotional conversations. As if I was a transaction that had become too complicated. I looked at the falling leaves while listening to my own son speak to me like a business problem. I used to hold you when you were sick, I said quietly. Silence. Mom, he warned, as if I had crossed an invisible line. I used to stay awake all night when you had fever, I continued. I used to. Stop, he interrupted. That one word. Stop. It didn't just cut the conversation. It cut something deeper. Something inside me that had been trying to hold on for too long. Please, I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was asking for anymore. Mom, I have investors with me, he said firmly now. We can talk later, don't make things difficult. And then the line ended again. This time, I didn't cry immediately. I just sat there, phone still in my hand, watching people pass by as if nothing in my world had just collapsed again. A child ran past me laughing, chasing a ball. His mother called after him gently. Careful. I watched them until they disappeared. And something inside me broke in a quieter way than before. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just acceptance beginning to replace hope. That evening, I did not go back to the shelter immediately. Instead, I walked farther than I usually did, until I reached a part of the city where buildings were taller, cleaner, colder. Glass towers reflected the sunset like fire trapped behind walls. I stopped outside one of them. People in suits entered through revolving doors. Security guards stood like silent gatekeepers of another universe. And I realized something painfully simple. My son lived in this world now. A world I had never been invited into. A world built with the very sacrifices I had made. I stood there for a long time, until a security guard noticed me. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked. I nodded quickly. "Yes, I'm just resting." But I wasn't resting. I was remembering. I was remembering a boy who once sat on my lap while I calculated bills on paper. A boy who once asked me why I never bought new clothes for myself. And I had smiled and said, "Because you are my priority." That sentence now felt like something I had signed my life away with. That night in the shelter, I couldn't sleep. Ruth, the old woman I had met earlier, noticed me sitting awake. "You spoke to him again?" she asked. I nodded slowly. She sighed, not surprised. "Did he listen?" I shook my head. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she looked at me with tired eyes. Sometimes children don't hear mothers anymore when success starts speaking louder in their ears. I didn't respond, because I didn't want to accept that truth yet. The next morning, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the shelter. Not for everyone, just for me. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was from a legal office in New York. My heart tightened immediately. I read carefully, slowly. It mentioned property transfers, corporate assets, collateral liquidation, and then a line that made the world around me go still. My signature had been used in multiple financial agreements tied to Daniel's company. I read it again, and again. My mind refused to accept it. I didn't understand all the legal language, but I understood enough. My house, my name, my trust. It hadn't just been used for a loan. It had been integrated into something much larger. Something I had never fully agreed to understand. My hands shook as I called the number on the letter. A receptionist answered, then transferred me. A lawyer's voice came on the line. "Mrs. Khan, your son is currently listed as primary executive authority over the assets tied to your property. Everything was signed digitally with your consent." "My consent," I repeated. "Yes, records show authorization." My voice dropped. I didn't understand what I was signing. A pause. Then the lawyer said something that stayed with me longer than anything else. "Ma'am, in legal terms, trust is still consent." Trust. That word again. The same word I had given my son without hesitation. The same word he had used to take everything I had left. When the call ended, I didn't move for a long time. The shelter around me kept going, people talking, walking, living, but I felt like I was sitting inside a different world now. A world where I finally understood what had happened. It wasn't just abandonment. It wasn't just distance. It was structured, intentional. And my son was not only succeeding. He was succeeding with pieces of my life beneath his foundation. That night, I looked at the ceiling again, but this time I didn't search for answers. I only asked one question inside my mind. When did I stop being his mother and become part of his business? And somewhere deep inside me, something quiet and painful began to form. Not revenge. Not anger. Something far more dangerous. Clarity. And this clarity would soon lead me toward a truth I was not yet ready to face, about Daniel, about my house, and about what he had truly become while I was still calling him my son. The morning after I received that letter, I didn't feel like I had slept at all. My body had rested, but my mind had stayed trapped in that single sentence. Records show authorization. Authorization. Such a clean word for something that felt like betrayal, wrapped in legal ink. I left the shelter earlier than usual. The air outside was sharp, but I didn't feel it the same way anymore. It was as if my body had started accepting pain as normal, like it was simply another part of being alive. I walked without direction until I reached a small public bus stop. I sat there for a long time, watching buses come and go, each one carrying people somewhere I no longer belonged. My phone was still in my hand. Daniel's name was still there. For the first time in days, I didn't call him. I just stared at his name and asked myself something I had been avoiding. Was I still his mother, or just a name he had used? The question didn't leave me. It followed me like a shadow. That afternoon, I made a decision I didn't fully understand until I was already doing it. I went to the public library again. Not to search for him this time, but to search for truth. I sat at the computer and typed carefully, my hands slower than usual. Daniel Kahn Company, Legal Filings, New York. Pages loaded. Articles appeared. Corporate registrations. Investment summaries. Press releases. And then I saw it. His company's official website. Clean, modern, expensive looking even through a screen. There was a section called Founding Story. I clicked it. I read it once. Then again. It said he had started the company with support from early private backing and family collateral restructuring. Family collateral restructuring. I felt my chest tighten. My house. My signature. My trust. All reduced to a phrase that sounded like innovation instead of loss. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the screen. Around me, people typed, studied, lived normal lives. But I felt like I was watching my own life from a distance now. Not living it. Just observing what was left of it. Then I saw something else. A press photo. Daniel standing at a conference. Smiling confidently. Behind him, a banner with his company name. And next to him was a woman in a sharp suit. The caption read, Chief Legal Advisor. I stared at her face for a long time. Because I understood something in that moment. My son hadn't just grown away from me. He had built a new world where I was not only absent. I was unnecessary. That night, I returned to the shelter later than usual. Ruth was sitting near the entrance, as always. She looked at me and immediately knew something had changed. You found something, she said. I sat beside her slowly. Yes. She didn't ask what. She just waited. And that silence made it easier to speak. He used my house, I said quietly. My name, my trust, everything. Ruth nodded slowly, like she had heard similar stories too many times. And now, she asked. I didn't answer immediately. Because I didn't know. What do you do when the person you gave your life to becomes the reason you lost it? I don't think he sees me anymore, I finally said. Ruth looked at me for a long moment. People like him don't see what reminds them of where they came from, she said gently. It makes them uncomfortable. Her words didn't shock me. They confirmed what I was already beginning to understand. That night, I couldn't stay inside. I walked again. This time without purpose. The city felt different now. Every light felt like it belonged to someone else's story. Every window looked like a life I had been excluded from. And somewhere in that silence, I started remembering smaller things. Daniel as a child, sitting on the kitchen floor drawing shapes while I cooked. Daniel asking me once, Mom, are we poor? And me laughing softly, saying, we are rich in each other. I stopped walking. Because that sentence now felt like the biggest lie I had ever told. I had been rich in him, but he had used that richness to build something that no longer included me. A taxi passed by slowly. Inside, a family was laughing. I turned my face away. Not because I was angry, but because I couldn't bear how normal the world still was, while mine had collapsed quietly. The next morning brought another letter. This one was different. It wasn't legal. It was personal. A short note, handwritten. From Daniel. My hands shook as I opened it. It said, "Mom, I know you're upset. Things are complicated. I didn't take anything from you intentionally. Everything was necessary for the company to survive. I will make it right when things stabilize. Please trust me." I read it again. And again. Please trust me. That sentence. That same trust. The same trust that had already taken everything from me once. I sat there for a long time holding the paper. Ruth watched me from across the room. "You okay?" she asked. I didn't answer immediately, because I was no longer sure what okay meant. "I think he believes what he is saying," I finally said. Ruth shook her head slightly. "That's the dangerous part," she replied. I folded the letter carefully. Not because it gave me comfort, but because it confirmed something deeper. He wasn't denying what happened. He was justifying it. That evening, I walked further than I had ever walked before. I ended up near a courthouse. People were coming in and out, lawyers in suits, families holding documents, lives being decided in quiet rooms. I stood outside for a long time. And for the first time, I thought not like a mother, but like someone who had been erased through paperwork. If my trust had been legally converted, if my name was on documents I didn't fully understand, then this wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was structure, system, and I realized something that chilled me more than anything before. My son hadn't just taken my home. He had made it legal for it to no longer be mine. That night, I returned to the shelter and sat down without speaking to anyone. Ruth sat beside me quietly. After a long time, she said, "You can't undo what's already been written on paper." I nodded slowly. But inside me, something else was forming now. Not denial. Not confusion. Something sharper. Something awake. Because now, I understood the shape of what I was facing. And I also understood something else. If everything had been done through systems, signatures, and silence, then truth would not come from waiting. It would come from looking deeper than the version of the story my son had chosen to tell. And for the first time since losing my home, I started thinking not about what I had lost, but about what exactly Daniel had built using it. That night, sleep didn't come at all. It wasn't insomnia in the usual sense. It was something heavier, like my mind had stopped agreeing to rest while it was still holding unanswered questions. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw documents, my signature, legal words twisting into meanings I had never intended. And above all of it, Daniel's voice saying, "Please trust me." Trust. That word no longer felt like something soft. It felt like a tool. Morning arrived gray and cold again. The shelter had its usual rhythm, people waking, folding blankets, leaving quietly. But I moved differently now. Slower, more aware, as if every step required thought. Ruth noticed immediately. "You didn't sleep," she said. I shook my head. "No." She didn't press further. She rarely did. That was her way. She understood that some pain refuses conversation until it is ready to spill on its own. I sat near the entrance with a cup of weak tea. My hands were steady now, but only on the outside. Inside, something was tightening. I kept thinking about the letter Daniel had sent. Everything was necessary for the company to survive. Survive. As if my house had been part of some natural selection process. As if my life's only stability had been an acceptable sacrifice in a larger equation. I finally stood up. "I need to go somewhere," I said quietly. Ruth looked up. "Where?" I hesitated. "I don't know yet." That was the truth. For the first time since everything collapsed, I wasn't walking because I was lost. I was walking because I needed answers. The bus took me toward downtown Chicago again. The city felt louder than usual, or maybe I was just noticing it more. Everything seemed sharper, horns, footsteps, conversations I wasn't part of. I stopped outside a small legal aid office I had passed before, but never entered. Today, I went in. The inside was plain. Chairs lined against walls. People waiting with folders, papers, expressions of quiet exhaustion. A receptionist asked my name. I gave it. After a while, I was called into a small office. A woman in her 40s sat across from me. Calm eyes, professional voice. "How can I help you today?" I hesitated again, because saying it out loud made it real. "My house was taken," I said, "through documents I signed, but I didn't fully understand them." She leaned slightly forward. "Do you have copies of anything?" I nodded and handed her the letter I had received. She read it slowly. Her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. "This involves corporate collateral agreements," she said finally. I stared at her. "I don't understand that." She closed the file gently. "It means your property was legally tied into business financing structures. If you signed authorization, even partially understood, it may have been binding." My throat tightened. "I trusted my son," I said. She paused. "I see," she replied softly. There was no judgment in her voice, but there was something worse. Understanding. Because she had seen this before. Many times. She continued, "Do you want to challenge it?" I hesitated. Because the question wasn't legal. It was emotional. Was I ready to turn my son into an opponent in a legal system? "I just want my home back," I whispered. She looked at me for a moment, then said something that stayed with me long after I left the office. "Sometimes, recovering property is harder than recovering truth." Truth. That word again. I left the office with a small folder of documents and instructions I barely understood, but something had shifted inside me. Not hope. Not yet. Awareness. That night, I didn't return to the shelter immediately. I sat outside a small cafe, watching people inside laugh, talk, live normal lives without thinking about legal documents or betrayal. And I thought about Daniel. Not the businessman. Not the executive. But the boy who once hid behind me during thunderstorms. Where did that version of him go? Or had he always been capable of becoming this? My phone rang suddenly. I almost dropped it. His name. Daniel. For a moment, I couldn't move. Then I answered. "Mom," he said immediately, voice low, controlled. "Why are you contacting lawyers?" My stomach tightened. "So you know," I said quietly. A pause. "I saw the inquiry," he replied. "This is not necessary." "Necessary," I repeated. "Yes," he said quickly. "These processes are complicated. You don't understand how business structures work. If you interfere now, it could damage everything." "Everything?" I asked. "Or your company?" Another pause. His tone shifted slightly, less patient now. "Mom, I told you I would handle it. Why are you doing this?" Something inside me cracked, not loudly but clearly. "I lost my home, Daniel." "I know," he said, "and I will fix it, but not like this." "Like what?" I asked. "By creating legal complications," he replied firmly. "You need to trust me." That word again. Trust me. But now it sounded different. Not like a promise. Like a command. "I trusted you before," I said quietly. Silence. Longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice was colder. "Mom, I can't keep having emotional conversations like this. I'm in the middle of something important." Important. As if I was. As if losing everything I had was just background noise to his success. "I'm your mother," I said. A short exhale on the other side. "Yes," he replied, "and I'm trying to take care of things in the best way I can." But he wasn't taking care of me. That part remained unspoken. The call ended again. I sat there holding the phone long after the screen went dark. And for the first time, I didn't feel like crying immediately. Instead, I felt something colder forming, clarity sharpening into focus, because I was starting to see a pattern now. Every time I asked questions, every time I tried to understand, the answer always led back to the same place. Distance, control, silence. That night, I returned to the shelter later than usual again. Ruth looked at me as I entered. "You spoke to him," she said. I nodded. "He doesn't want me involved," I replied. She gave a small, tired smile. "That usually means you're closer than you think." I didn't respond, but her words stayed with me. That night, I opened the folder the lawyer had given me. Pages of legal language filled with unfamiliar terms. But one phrase appeared more than once. Beneficial ownership transfer. I read it slowly. Again. And again. And slowly, I began to understand something I had not been ready to see before. My house had not just been taken. It had been transferred. Step by step. Through trust. Through paperwork. Through silence. And Daniel hadn't just inherited success. He had engineered it, using me as part of the foundation. I closed the folder. My hands were steady now. Not because I felt calm, but because something inside me had stopped shaking. I looked around the shelter, at people sleeping, surviving, forgotten. And I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. If my son had truly built everything on my loss, then the truth was not just about what I had lost. It was about what I had unknowingly helped build. And that meant this story was not over. It was only changing shape. And for the first time since everything began, I was no longer just a mother waiting for her son to return. I was someone beginning to understand how deeply I had been removed from his world and how deliberately it may have been done. The next few days felt different. Not easier, just clearer. Clarity is not comfort. It is exposure. It removes the fog that used to soften the edges of pain and replaces it with something sharper, more defined. I stopped wandering aimlessly. Instead, I started moving with intention. Every morning I would leave the shelter early, not to escape, but to understand. I returned to the legal aid office twice more. Each time I brought whatever documents I could find, old emails, printed confirmations, the letter Daniel had sent. The lawyer I met, her name was Ms. Carter, began to recognize me. "You've been going through a lot of paperwork," she said one afternoon, scanning the files again. I nodded. "I need to understand what happened," I replied. She leaned back slightly in her chair. "From what I can see," she said carefully, "your property was used as secured collateral for a business loan structure tied to your son's company. It was not a simple transfer. It was layered financing." Layered financing. The words meant nothing emotionally, but they carried weight legally. "What does that mean for me?" I asked. She hesitated. "It means," she said slowly, "that multiple agreements are stacked on top of each other. Even if one layer is challenged, others may still hold. It becomes difficult to unwind." Difficult. That word again. I had heard it from Daniel, too. Everything was always difficult when I was the one asking questions. "And my signature?" I asked. She opened another document. "It appears to be digitally authorized, but there are indications that the authorization process was expedited." I looked at her. "Expedited," I repeated. She nodded. "Sometimes in business transactions, consent is confirmed through simplified verification when trust relationships are assumed." Trust relationships. My chest tightened slightly. "So my trust was the verification," I said. She didn't deny it. That silence was enough. After that meeting, I walked out of the office and stood outside for a long time. The wind was colder than I expected. People passed me, rushing, talking, carrying their lives forward as if nothing in the world was breaking. But inside me, something had shifted again. Not collapse this time. Structure, understanding, was beginning to form its own shape inside me. That evening, I didn't go straight back to the shelter. I went somewhere else. A small internet cafe near the library. I paid for an hour and sat at a computer. This time, I didn't search for Daniel's company. I searched for him. Not the businessman. Not the founder. Just Daniel Kahn. And slowly, pieces began to appear that I had never paid attention to before. Old interviews. University articles. Profiles from his early career. And then something that made me pause. A mention of an early startup mentor. A man named Richard Hale. He appeared in multiple articles from Daniel's early days in New York. Advisor during initial restructuring phase. Strategic mentor in capital formation. I wrote the name down carefully. Something about it felt important. Not obvious, but important in a way my instincts didn't want to ignore. That night in the shelter, I asked Ruth about it. She was sitting near the entrance again, as always. I found a name connected to him, I said. She looked up. Who? Richard Hale, I replied. Her expression changed slightly, not surprised but attentive. You think he matters? She asked. I don't know, I said honestly, but he appears in everything from the beginning. Ruth nodded slowly. People like your son don't build alone, she said. They are usually guided early. Guided? That word sat differently in my mind. Not like trust. Not like betrayal. Like influence. The next morning, I made another decision. I went to New York. I didn't plan it carefully. I didn't have a detailed map of what I would do once I arrived. I only knew one thing: staying still in Chicago was no longer enough. The bus ride was long, quiet. I sat by the window the entire time, watching the landscape change from gray industrial edges to busier highways. As we approached New York, the buildings began to rise again, taller, sharper, more aggressive. Each one looked like it was competing to exist. When I arrived, I didn't go to Daniel's company. I didn't go to his office. Instead, I went to the address I found connected to Richard Hale, a consulting firm in Manhattan. The building was smaller than I expected, not flashy like Daniel's world, more controlled, quiet confidence instead of loud success. I stood outside for a few minutes before entering. Inside, the receptionist asked my name. I'm here to ask about someone, I said. Do you have an appointment? No, I replied. She looked uncertain. I added softly, it's about Daniel Kahn. That name changed something in her expression. One moment of recognition. Then she made a call. After a short wait, I was asked to sit. Not long after, a man in his late 60s came out. He was calm, composed, dressed simply. Mrs. Kahn, he asked. I nodded. I'm Richard Hale, he said. We sat in a small meeting room. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, I've heard your name before. That surprised me. You have? I asked. He nodded slowly. Yes, from Daniel. My stomach tightened. What did he say about me? I asked. He studied me for a moment before answering. He said you were supportive, very trusting. Trusting. That word again. Always returning in different forms. I exhaled slowly. I didn't come here for compliments, I said. He nodded, as if expecting that. Then why did you come? He asked gently. I placed my hands on the table. Because I want to understand what happened to my house, I said. A pause. A long one. Then he leaned back slightly. I see, he said. And something about the way he said it made my chest tighten again. Not defensively. Not aggressively. But knowingly. You were part of the early structure, he continued carefully, before things expanded. I didn't choose to be part of anything, I said. He nodded again. That's not entirely how these systems work, he replied. Systems. That word again. I trusted my son, I said firmly. He looked at me for a long time, then said something I was not prepared for. Trust is often what makes early-stage capital possible. I stared at him. What does that mean? He hesitated. Your son's company needed collateral validation early on, he said. Your property provided that stability. My voice dropped. So I was collateral. He didn't correct me. He didn't agree either. But his silence answered for him. I felt something inside me shift again. Not collapse. Recognition. Slow, painful recognition. You knew this would happen, I asked. He exhaled. No, he said carefully. I don't think anyone saw the emotional consequences clearly at the beginning. Emotional consequences. As if I was a side effect. Not a person. I stood up slowly. Where's my son now? I asked. He looked at me carefully. Building something very large, he said. I nodded. Yes, I replied, on what was once mine. He didn't respond. And I left. Outside, New York felt louder than before. But I wasn't overwhelmed anymore. Something had changed inside me during that conversation. I now understood the shape of the world Daniel had entered. And I also understood something else. This was not just a story about a son who abandoned his mother. It was a story about systems that rewarded trust until trust became usable. That night, I sat on a bench outside a subway station, watching people move like they belonged somewhere. I took out my phone. Daniel's name was still there. I didn't call him. Instead, I whispered to myself, now I understand the shape of your world. And for the first time since everything began, I wasn't only remembering what I had lost. I was beginning to see where it had gone. That night in New York, I didn't return to a shelter. I couldn't. Something in me refused the idea of going back to a place where I would wake up tomorrow still confused. After meeting Richard Hale, confusion had started to thin out, not disappear, but organize itself into something structured, something I could finally look at without breaking apart immediately. So I stayed outside. The city doesn't care where you sleep, as long as you don't disturb its movement. I found a quiet bench near a subway entrance. Not comfortable, not safe, but present. That was enough for that night. People passed me constantly. No one stopped. In New York, invisibility is not a tragedy, it is normal. And I began thinking differently now. Not emotionally. Analytically. That frightened me a little, because I realized I was starting to think the way Daniel probably did. Not about feelings first, but about structure, about systems, about what connects to what. My son was no longer just a son in my mind. He had become a node inside something larger. And I was trying to find where I had been placed inside it, or removed from it. The word Richard Hale used stayed with me. Collateral validation. It sounded clinical, clean, almost harmless. But I now understood what it meant. I had not been involved emotionally by accident. I had been positioned. My trust had been part of a system that required trust to function. And once I accepted that thought, a second thought followed, one I didn't want but couldn't stop. If I was part of the structure, then I could also trace it. That morning, I went back to the city streets with a different purpose. I wasn't wandering anymore. I was mapping. I walked toward Daniel's company building. I didn't go inside. I stood across the street. It was taller than I expected. Glass, steel, reflections of everything around it but revealing nothing inside. People in suits entered and exited like they were part of a rhythm I no longer understood. I watched carefully, and for the first time, I didn't see success. I saw maintenance. A machine being kept alive by constant movement. I realized something simple. Nothing that large stays stable on its own. It needs continuous input. Capital, trust, leverage. And somewhere in that chain, I was still present, even if I had been physically removed. I sat on a nearby bench and observed for a long time. Then I saw him. Daniel. For a moment, I wasn't sure. But I knew his posture, even from a distance, the way he moved with controlled urgency, the way he didn't look around unless necessary. He walked out of the building with 2 other men. He looked different now. Not just older, more sealed off. Like someone who had learned to contain himself completely. I stood up instinctively. My heart reacted before my mind could decide anything. But I didn't approach him. I just watched. He spoke to the men briefly, then shook hands, professional, efficient. Then he turned slightly. And for a brief moment, he looked in my direction. Not directly at me, but close enough that my body froze. I don't know if he recognized me, or if I only imagined that possibility, because I needed it to feel real. He turned away and got into a black car. And just like that, he was gone. I stayed standing long after the car disappeared. Something inside me tightened. Not grief. Not anger. Something closer to realization solidifying. That evening, I did something I hadn't done before. I followed the structure instead of the person. I went back to Richard Hale's office. This time, I didn't ask for Daniel. I asked for records. Not directly. Carefully. I told the receptionist I was trying to understand past financial arrangements involving family collateral structures. She hesitated, then brought someone else. A younger assistant this time. He listened more cautiously. But something changed when I mentioned the house. He asked me to wait. After a while, he returned with printed pages. These are general structural summaries, he said. Nothing confidential. But I could tell he was testing how much I understood. I took the papers and sat down. They weren't detailed contracts, but they showed something important. A sequence. Early capital. Collateral tie-in. Expansion leverage. Reinvestment cycles. My house was listed, not as property, but as secured foundational asset. I read that line over and over. Secured foundational asset. Not a home. Not a memory. An asset. I closed my eyes for a moment. And when I opened them, I felt something different. Not brokenness. Precision. I now understood the language they used. And that meant I could start understanding how it could be undone, or at least examined. When I left the office, the assistant stopped me. "Are you related to Mr. Khan?" he asked carefully. "Yes," I said. He nodded slowly, as if choosing his next words. "Then you should know," he said. "He's under pressure from multiple investors right now. The structure is unstable." Unstable. That word again. Everything in this world was either stable or unstable. And people like me, people like my son, were used to keep it temporarily stable. That night, I didn't sit on a bench. I found a cheap hostel room. Not comfort, just walls. And I opened the papers again. I started tracing connections. Names. Dates. Patterns. And slowly, something began forming in my mind. Not a story. A map. And on that map, I started to see something I hadn't seen before. My role was not only at the beginning. It was still embedded. Residual. Active. Because trust, once converted into structure, does not simply disappear when the person withdraws. It continues to exist in the system until it is formally removed. And no one had removed me, which meant I was still inside it. That realization made me sit very still for a long time. Because it meant something else too. If I was still inside the structure, then I still had a position, even if I had been discarded emotionally. The next morning, I made another decision. I would not only observe anymore, I would understand the full architecture. Not for revenge. Not yet. But because ignorance had already cost me everything. And now, knowledge was the only thing I had left that could not be taken easily. Before leaving the hostel, I wrote something on a small piece of paper. Follow the structure, not the emotion. I didn't know yet how far that path would take me. But for the first time since Daniel stopped being reachable, I was no longer waiting for him. I was moving through the system he built. And I was beginning to see that the story of my loss was not just behind me. It was still unfolding in real time, inside the same structure that had taken my home and turned my trust into its foundation. The phrase I had written on that small piece of paper followed me like a quiet instruction. Follow the structure, not the emotion. For the first time since everything began, I stopped reacting to pain and started tracking patterns. New York felt different now, not softer, not kinder, but readable. Like a system that only reveals itself when you stop begging it for sympathy. I began my day early. Not wandering anymore, not drifting. I went back to the legal aid contacts in Manhattan, but this time I asked more specific questions. Not about my feelings, not about betrayal. About structure. About how assets are layered. About how collateral moves through business systems. Ms. Carter's words had already planted something in me, but now I was trying to see it fully. At one office, a young analyst listened carefully as I explained what I was trying to understand. He leaned back slightly. "You're describing a secured asset chain," he said. That phrase again. Secured. Chain. I nodded slowly. "Can you show me how it works in simple terms?" I asked. He pulled out a sheet of paper and drew a rough diagram. Boxes, lines, arrows. "This is a typical structure," he said. "On one side you have personal collateral, like property. That gets tied to early-stage financing. That financing enables business expansion. Then the business raises further capital based on the perceived stability of those early assets." I watched closely. "And the original owner?" I asked. He paused. "They usually remain linked indirectly," he said, "unless the structure is unwound legally." Unwound. I repeated the word silently. That meant it could be reversed. But not easily. Never easily. That afternoon, I went to a public cafe and studied everything I had collected so far. Documents. Names. Notes. Richard Hale. Daniel's company filings. My property listing as foundational asset. And slowly, something began to form, not a feeling but a sequence. My house had not simply been taken. It had been activated. Like a key turning something on. And once it was part of the structure, it continued to generate stability for something much larger than me. That realization did not make me cry. It made me still. Because now I understood something important. Daniel did not just take from me once. He was still using what he took. Even now. That evening, I returned to Richard Hale's office again. This time, I didn't ask to see him. I asked to see any historical structure summaries involving early collateral frameworks tied to Daniel Kahn's startup phase. The receptionist looked hesitant again. But something about my tone must have changed. Because after a long pause, she allowed me to wait. This time, a different man came out. Older than the assistant, more formal. He sat across from me, without speaking for a moment. Then said, "You've been asking very precise questions." "I need to understand," I replied. He studied me carefully. Then said, "Understanding sometimes changes what you can do next." "I already lost everything," I said quietly. "There is nothing left to protect from understanding." That made him pause. Then he stood up. "Come with me," he said. We moved to a side room. He placed a folder on the table. "This is not official disclosure," he said, "but I think you deserve clarity." I opened it slowly. Inside were structured summaries. And there it was again. My property. Listed multiple times, across early-stage financial stabilization points. But this time, I saw something I had not noticed before. There were timestamps. My signature had been recorded in phases. Not just once. Multiple authorizations. Spread over time. "Why is it split like this?" I asked. He exhaled. "Because initial trust authorization was expanded incrementally," he said. "As the company grew, additional leverage was required." My voice lowered. "So they came back to me again and again." He nodded. "Yes, through digital confirmations." My mind tried to process it. Daniel hadn't just used my trust once. He had layered it. Like building blocks. Each stage dependent on my original consent. Even if I didn't fully understand it. I closed the folder slowly. "Is he aware of this?" I asked. The man hesitated. "Yes," he said. That answer landed heavier than anything before. Because it meant something I had been avoiding thinking clearly. Daniel knew exactly how the structure worked. He wasn't a passive beneficiary. He was part of its continuation. When I left the office, the air outside felt different again. Heavier. Not because the world had changed, but because I had. That night, I walked further than usual. I ended up near the East River. The water was dark, reflecting lights from buildings that looked untouched by human cost. I sat on a low wall and looked across the city. And I finally allowed myself a thought I had been avoiding for a long time. Not emotional. Not accusatory. Just factual. My son built something successful using my trust as infrastructure. And I was still inside that infrastructure, just no longer visible as a person. Only as a component. That realization should have destroyed me. But it didn't. Instead, something else began forming underneath it. A question. If I was still part of the structure, then I still had proximity to it. And if I still had proximity, then I was not completely powerless. I didn't yet know what that meant. But I understood enough to stop seeing myself only as someone who had been discarded. I was also someone who had unknowingly helped build something that still depended on what I once gave freely. And systems that depend on something can sometimes be traced backward. That night, I wrote another line on a new piece of paper. What is still connected can still be followed. And for the first time, I stopped thinking of Daniel as someone far away in a glass tower, and started thinking of him as someone standing inside a structure that still had threads leading back to me. Even if he didn't want to see them, the morning after the river, I woke up with a strange sense of direction. Not certainty. Direction. There is a difference. Certainty feels like comfort. Direction feels like responsibility. New York was still loud, still indifferent, still moving like nothing beneath its surface ever mattered. But I no longer experienced it as chaos. I started seeing layers instead. Movements that looked random but weren't. Systems that looked permanent but depended on repetition. And somewhere inside those systems, my son existed. And so did I. Still, even if only indirectly. I went back to the papers again in the hostel room. This time I didn't just read. I compared. Line by line. Date by date. I started noticing something subtle but important. Every expansion phase in Daniel's company had a trigger point. And every trigger point aligned with a financial stabilization input. And those inputs always looped back to early secured assets, including mine. It was like watching a machine breathe. In, out, in, out. And each breath required something real to hold it together. I wrote everything down on the small notebook I had bought. Not feelings, not memories, just structure. Then I saw something that made me pause longer than usual. A pattern of timing. Every time Daniel's company faced expansion pressure, there was a corresponding activation of additional collateral layers tied to my property. But one thing stood out. The most recent activation was not initiated through new consent. It was triggered automatically. I stared at that line. Automatically. That didn't make sense at first. So I read it again. And again. Then I realized what it meant. The structure had become self-sustaining. My original trust signature had evolved into a standing authorization framework. In simple terms, I was no longer being asked. I had already been built into the system, and the system now acted without needing me. I closed the notebook slowly. My hands were steady. Too steady. Because something had shifted inside me again. This time, it wasn't confusion disappearing. It was emotional distance forming. Not from my son. From the idea that I was still only a victim in a simple story. I was. I was part of a structure that continued to function. That afternoon, I went to a public records center. I asked for corporate filings again. But this time I asked for something specific. Any restructuring changes involving early-stage collateral assets tied to Daniel Kahn's company. The clerk looked at me for a moment. "You're looking at a lot of financial data," she said. "I just need clarity," I replied. After some waiting, I was given access to archived filings. And there it was again. My house. Referenced multiple times. But now with additional notes. Extended collateral dependency, maintained for operational continuity. Operational continuity. My life reduced to continuity for someone else's success. I sat there for a long time in the quiet reading room. No one noticed me. No one needed to. That was the truth of my current existence. Not invisible. Just irrelevant to the system and less referenced. When I finally left, I didn't go back to the hostel immediately. I walked through Manhattan instead. And something unusual happened. I started noticing conversations differently. People weren't just talking. They were negotiating value. Even casually. Even unconsciously. Everything in this city was connected to exchange. Time. Effort. Money. Influence. And somewhere inside that exchange system, my son had become extremely efficient. That realization should have hurt more. But instead, it clarified something else. Efficiency doesn't happen without input. And input always leaves traces. That night, I returned to Richard Hale's office one more time. This time, I didn't ask for documents. I asked for understanding. He seemed unsurprised when I arrived. Almost as if he expected me again. "You've been tracing things," he said. "Yes," I replied. He nodded slowly. That usually happens when people start seeing the structure instead of the outcome. I looked at him directly. Was my son aware that my property would remain active in the system like this? A long pause followed. Then he answered carefully. "Daniel understood the mechanics early," he said. "He had to. The structure required precision." "Did he understand me?" I asked. That question lingered longer in the air. Finally, he said, "I think he understood what you gave, more than what it cost you." That was not an answer I wanted. But it was honest enough to feel real. I stood up. "I want access to the full trace of where my collateral is currently active," I said. He frowned slightly. "That is not something individuals usually request." "I'm not asking as an individual," I said quietly. "I'm asking as the origin point of the structure." That made him stop. For the first time, he looked at me differently. Not as a grieving mother. not as someone lost, but as something closer to what I was beginning to become. A node that had started to trace itself. He finally said, "I can't give you full access, but I can show you something partial." He opened a file on his screen. And there it was. A live dependency map. Lines stretching outward from a central node, labeled Family Collateral Framework. And one of those lines still connected back to my property. Even now. Even after everything. My breath slowed. "So I am still active," I said softly. He didn't correct me. That silence was enough again. I left the office without speaking further. Outside, the city felt different once more. Not overwhelming. Not distant. But connected. As if I had finally found my position inside it. That night, I didn't sit on a bench. I didn't wander. I returned to the hostel and sat on the bed with my notebook. And I wrote one final line for that day. If I am still connected, then I am still part of the flow. And for the first time, I stopped asking only where my son was, and started asking something more important. Where exactly do I sit inside what he built? And what happens if that connection is never fully closed? The question I wrote that night didn't leave me alone. Where do I sit inside what he built? It repeated in my mind like a quiet echo that refused to fade, even when I tried to sleep. By now, sleep had stopped being rest. It had become interruption. New York mornings felt sharper after that realization, not because the city had changed, but because I had started looking at it like a system instead of a place. Everything began to look connected, even things that didn't seem related at first. That morning, I returned to the Public Records Center again. The same building, the same fluorescent lights, the same quiet tension of people waiting for information that might change their lives. But I was no longer waiting passively. I was searching for continuity. Not events. Connections. I asked for anything related to dependency structure updates, tied to the collateral framework. The clerk hesitated again. "You've been very persistent with this," she said. I nodded. "I need to understand what is still active," I replied. After a short wait, I was given access to a restricted viewing terminal. Not full records, but partial system snapshots. When the screen loaded, I saw something I didn't expect. My name appeared again. Not as owner. Not as borrower. As legacy collateral anchor. I stared at it. Anchor. That word felt heavier than all the legal terms combined. It didn't mean ownership. It meant stabilization. I read further. The system still listed my property as a risk-balancing asset node. Even though I no longer lived there. Even though it had already been foreclosed. It still existed inside the system as active structure support. My throat tightened slightly. Not because I didn't understand anymore, but because I did. Completely. I sat there for a long time without moving. Around me, people continued scanning documents, typing, whispering. Their lives were still moving forward in simple directions. Mine no longer felt simple. It felt layered, like something underneath something else. When I finally left, I walked without thinking for a while. Until I realized I was heading toward Daniel's company again. Not intentionally, but instinctively. The building came into view like it always did. Glass, height, reflection. But this time I didn't stop far away. I crossed the street and stood closer. Closer than before. I watched employees enter and exit. Phones in hands. Expressions focused. And I understood something important. This system didn't just use capital. It used continuity of belief. People believed in its stability. Investors believed. Employees believed. Even my son believed in maintaining it. And somewhere beneath all that belief, there was a structure still quietly depending on me. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to, because now I understood what I came for. Not confrontation, not reunion, understanding. Later that afternoon, I met Richard Hale again. This time, he didn't seem surprised at all. "You've mapped more of it, haven't you?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He nodded slowly. "And what do you see now?" I thought carefully before answering. "I see that I am still inside the system," I said, "even without living in it." He didn't deny it. "Instead," he said, "that is often the hardest realization for people in your position." "My position," I repeated. He nodded. "Origin contributors to early-stage collateral frameworks rarely exit cleanly," he said. "Their input remains structurally embedded." Embedded. That word again. Not removed. Not erased. Embedded. "So I can be traced," I said quietly. "Yes," he replied. "And I can trace back," I added. He looked at me for a moment longer this time. "You are thinking more like the system now," he said. I didn't respond immediately, because I knew he was right. And that disturbed me more than anything else. That evening, I didn't return to the hostel immediately. I walked instead. And as I walked, something unexpected happened inside me. The emotional weight of what had happened began to separate from the structural understanding of it. Not disappearing. Separating. Like two different layers of the same experience. One was grief. The other was architecture. And for the first time, I realized I could examine one without drowning in the other. That night, I sat alone on a quiet street corner. And I wrote again. I am not outside the system. I'm a layer within it. But then I paused and added something else. If I am a layer, then I can be located. The idea didn't feel emotional. It felt precise, like a coordinate. And for the first time since Daniel stopped being reachable in the way he once was, I stopped thinking of him as someone far away and started thinking of him as someone inside a structure I now understood well enough to navigate. Even if he didn't realize, I was still part of its foundation. Even if he no longer saw me as his mother in any meaningful sense. Because now I understood something else. Systems don't forget their foundations. They just stop acknowledging them. And that meant one final thing was becoming clear to me. If I truly understood the structure now, then I was no longer only someone who had been used by it. I was also someone who could potentially follow its flow back to where everything was still actively moving. Including him, that night I didn't sleep at all. Not because of fear this time, but because something inside me had shifted into a different kind of awareness. I was no longer only carrying what had happened. I was tracking it. New York at night felt different when you stopped looking at it as a city and started seeing it as layers of activity. Light patterns, building systems, financial centers, all of it moving like a single organism. And somewhere inside that organism, my son was not just existing. He was operating. I stayed in the same small hostel room, but I didn't lie down. I sat near the window and watched the street below. Cars passed. People moved. Life continued as if nothing inside it was fractured. But I knew better now. I had seen the structure. And once you see structure, you stop trusting appearances. That morning, I returned again to Richard Hale's office. This time, I didn't wait long. He was already expecting me. "You've come back quickly," he said. "I don't have time to wait anymore," I replied. He studied me for a moment. Not as a victim anymore, but as something shifting. "Then what are you looking for now?" he asked. I placed my notebook on the table. "I want the full dependency trace," I said. "Not summaries, not explanations, the actual active link map." He exhaled slowly. "That level of visibility is not typically accessible," he said. "I am not typical," I replied. That made him pause. A long pause. Then he nodded once. All right, he said. He turned his screen toward me. And what I saw this time was different from everything before. Not documents, not summaries. A live structural network. Lines branching out across cities, institutions, accounts, assets. And at the center of it all, Daniel's company. But what shocked me wasn't the center. It was the edges. Because one of those lines, still traced back to a node, labeled with my name. Not an active. Not historical. Active structural reinforcement node. My breathing slowed. So it's still being used, I said quietly. He didn't deny it. It's part of a long-term stabilization loop, he said carefully. The system has not fully decoupled it. I stared at the screen. And he knows this, I said. A pause. Yes, he replied. That answer should have shattered me. But it didn't. Because something else had already started forming inside me. Something colder, clearer. Not emotion. Understanding of continuity. I leaned forward slightly. Show me where the flow currently passes, I said. He hesitated. Then clicked. Lines shifted. The network updated in real time. And I saw it. A pattern. A loop. My name appeared not as origin anymore, but as a stabilizing pass-through point in certain operational cycles tied to expansion funding. In simple terms, my trust signature was still being referenced in system logic, even if indirectly, even if I was no longer physically involved. I leaned back slowly. So I am still part of his operational structure, I said. Yes, he replied quietly. Not dramatic. Just factual. That was the moment something inside me changed again. Not grief. Not shock. Recognition turning into intent. Because I realized something very important. If I was still part of the structure, then I was not outside of his world. I was inside it in a way he could no longer easily remove. And if I could see the flow, then I could also understand where it concentrated, where it weakened, where it depended most on stability. That evening, I didn't return to the hostel. I stayed outside again, but this time I wasn't wandering. I was observing. I watched the financial district from a distance, and I began seeing it differently. Not as buildings, but as pressure points. Every successful system has weak dependencies disguised as strength. And I had just discovered one of them. Myself. But now that I understood it, I was no longer only a passive anchor. I was also a point of traceability. And anything that can be traced can be followed. That night, I wrote in my notebook, if I am still part of the structure, then I can move through it. And for the first time, I stopped thinking of Daniel as someone unreachable. I started thinking of him as someone standing inside a system I now understood well enough to navigate from the inside out. Not to destroy. Not yet. But to locate the truth of what had actually been built and what my trust had truly become inside it. The final morning in New York didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a threshold. Something inside me had already crossed over long before my body caught up to it. I woke up early again, but this time I didn't feel restless. I felt aligned, like every piece of what I had learned over the past days had settled into place. The structure was no longer confusing. It was visible. And visibility changes everything. I sat on the edge of the hostel bed and opened my notebook. The pages were filled now not with emotions but with maps. Names, connections, dependency flows, stabilization points. At the center of it all, one truth repeated in different forms. My trust had become infrastructure. And Daniel's success had grown on top of it. Not metaphorically. Structurally. That morning, I didn't go back to Richard Hale. I didn't go to the legal office. I didn't go to the financial district. Instead, I walked. Slowly. deliberately, through streets that once felt overwhelming, but now felt like pathways in a system I could finally interpret. I passed Daniel's building one last time. I stopped across the street. I didn't look for him this time. I looked at the building itself. Glass, steel, reflection. A structure that only exists because something beneath it remains stable. And I knew now what that stability had been. People walking past me didn't see anything unusual. Just a woman standing quietly. But inside me, something final had already formed. Not revenge. Not anger. Understanding of completion. Because I now knew three things clearly. My son had not acted randomly. The system had not been accidental. And I had not been irrelevant. I had been foundational. That is the most painful kind of truth, not that you were used, but that you were necessary for something that no longer acknowledges you. I took a deep breath and turned away from the building. For the first time, I wasn't looking back. That afternoon, I went to the train station. I didn't tell anyone. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no final call. Because I understood now that closure doesn't always come through dialogue. Sometimes it comes through recognition. On the platform, I sat quietly with my bag beside me. And I thought about Daniel, not as the person I lost, but as the person who had grown inside a structure I had unknowingly helped stabilize. A structure that no longer needed emotional connection to function. Only continuity. The train arrived. As I stepped inside, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was exiting a system I had finally mapped. And as the city began to move past the window, buildings, lights, reflections, I understood something that settled deeper than pain. I had not been erased. I had been embedded. And now I knew where. That knowledge changed everything. Not because it gave me control, but because it removed illusion. And without illusion, there is only clarity. Back in my seat, I opened my notebook one last time. And I wrote the final line. I am no longer inside the silence of what happened. I am inside the understanding of how it was built. The train moved forward. And for the first time in a long time, I moved with it, not as someone waiting to be returned to the past, but as someone who had finally seen the full shape of the story she was part of. And what came next was no longer confusion. It was awareness of everything that had been built and everything that could now finally be understood for what it truly was. The train kept moving, but my mind was no longer tied to any single place. New York was behind me now, but it didn't feel like I was escaping it. It felt like I was leaving after finally understanding it. For years, I had believed my story was simple: love, sacrifice, betrayal. A mother who gave everything, and a son who took more than he should have. But the truth I had seen was more layered than pain alone. Nothing in Daniel's world had been accidental. Not the documents, not the timing, not even my trust. Everything had been part of a structure that turned emotion into function and function into growth. And I had been inside that structure from the beginning. Not as a witness, but as a foundation. That realization didn't erase the hurt, but it changed what the hurt meant. Because now I understood something important. I was not powerless because I was forgotten. I was significant because I had been essential to what was built. The train passed through long stretches of quiet land. Cities faded behind us. Noise turned into distance. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was chasing my son anymore. I was no longer chasing anything. I was moving forward with knowledge instead of confusion. Daniel was still out there, in his world of glass buildings and layered systems. And I was still here, carrying the weight of everything that had formed that world. But the connection between us had changed shape. Not broken. Understood. I closed my notebook and placed it back in my bag. Outside the window, the light softened. And I realized something simple, something final. Some stories don't end with reconciliation or revenge. Some stories end when the truth is finally seen clearly enough that it no longer needs to be chased. And in that clarity, I finally allowed myself to rest, not because everything was fixed, but because I finally understood what had happened. And understanding, at last, became my ending.